Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. Today, I want to continue a discussion that I've had with previous guests like Vinnie Tortorich, Diana Rogers, and others. A discussion that is so important because our perceptions about how we view food, the food we eat, is shaped by the messages we hear from the media, so-called experts, and of course, on social media. The discussion I want to continue is the one related to how we perceive the production and consumption of livestock, because many of my patients still believe that they need to cut back on eating meat. To continue this discussion, I want to have a guest who sees the world through the lens of a rancher, a perspective that will help us connect some of the dots in a way that may surprise you. Today's guest is Dr. Peter Ballerstedt. Dr. Ballerstedt received his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture in 1981 and a Master's of Science in 1983, both from the University of Georgia. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Kentucky in 1986, specializing in forage management and utilization, minoring in ruminant nutrition. He was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from 1986 to 1992. He has a huge influence on many of the items or topics related to meat sustainability. He uses his expertise in agronomy, and he's going to have to help us with that to offer an interesting counter argument to the claim that ruminant agriculture is destroying the environment. And, it really was his personal experience that helped him see the world through a different lens and re-examine his diet and his health. And with that, Doc, I welcome you to the Protecting Your Nest podcast.
Well, thank you, Doctor. It's very nice to be here with you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember us meeting in person for the first time at Low Carb USA. I think we both had speaking assignments and we had a chance to even take a picture. I think it was tweeted with you, myself, Dr. Brian, and it was one other doctor or thought leader in the low carb space that was with us. And it was kind of cool to meet you, get to know you a little bit. And looking forward to continuing the journey as we have this conversation today. I know we follow each other on social media, and I'm just excited that you exist because we do need to see the world through the lens of others who may have a different perspective. So as you know, my podcast, although broad because it's a nest and a rope acronym that is very broad, is really rooted in a low carb way of thinking. And so I think many people who come to my podcast are always interested when others take a similar journey using, carb restriction as a way to heal from metabolic disease. So let's talk a little bit about your journey. How did you find the benefits of reducing carbs in your diet, and maybe a little bit about your family? And I think you have some pets. So let's talk a little bit about you as the person you are.
Well, thank you. The brief version is that in 2007, I had my moment of clarity where I realized I was a 51-year-old balding, obese, pre-diabetic. And at that point, Nancy, my wife, had already been exploring restricted carbohydrate, reading Michael and Mary Dan Eads, reading various blogs that were then available. That was just before Good Calories, Bad Calories came out. So I had a resident expert, plus I had some things to read and apply. And so my joke is that, today I'm just balding. I've reversed the prediabetes. I'm no longer, yeah, it's not a miracle, it'll do a lot of things, but I don't think that
Right.
one yet.
Yeah, I tried that already.
Yeah. So that's how I got started. And then a few years later, I had the opportunity because there was going to be this joint meeting of the American Society of Bariatric Physicians and the Nutrition and Metabolism Society up in Seattle. And so here, that's 5 hours north of where I live. So Gary Taubes was going to speak. Eric Westman was going to be there. I think Steve Finney was going to be there. All of these people. And so, of course, I went ahead and did that. Went up, learned a lot, had the experience of relating to clinicians what I had learned from Gary Taubes and others. And they were like, "What? Wait?" I was like, "Well, why don't you go buy his books? They're for sale, and you can." And then that was a time when I began to realize that even as a forage agronomist, I had something I could contribute to this metabolic health community.
Nice. And it's nice that you even thought that I need to contribute, right? And you saw there was a gap. And there's so there's so much importance in everybody asking themselves, how can I add value to the world? And honestly, I'm always surprised that there's not more people like myself and yourself in this low carb space. So I think the more the merrier. And for some of us, instead of just living in our little cocoon of, our practice, we need to kind of spread our wings a little bit because there's so many people. I meet people every day, whether it's a patient or a clinician, and they have heard none of the things that we talk about. It amazes me. so so we really need to have us out there sharing that message and giving people at least another option. So I really believe that's important.
Well, I
Um,
feel like I'm trying to build bridges between different disciplines. And I really want my colleagues in agriculture to hear the metabolic health message. And I've gotten to see
yeah,
people, my friends, my colleagues, take the information, apply it in their own lives, and see the results that now we see on a regular basis, but for them it was new, and get those messages from them. And then at the same time, I know a lot of things, my colleagues know a lot of things, we're doing things that more people need to know about, because what's agronomy, what's forages, what's ruminants, and okay, let's you don't need to know everything about it, but it's good to know a little bit, and also know where you can go for more information when something comes up and you should pardon the expression, another opinion.
that's right. And I'm glad you mentioned those terms because, I'm a city boy and I have, high rises not far from me and, we live closer to each other. So, some of those terms are terms that some of my listeners may not be familiar with. And so you mentioned, I mentioned in the intro that, you were a forage extension specialist at Oregon State. I also mentioned the term ruminate agriculture. So maybe we should pause and just make sure our listeners know what those terms mean. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly are those terms so we can level set for people as we continue this conversation.
Sure. So forages are plants that are grown to be consumed by animals, either directly in pasture or cut it and store it as hay. So either of those would be forages. Uh, there are plovers, alfalfa, grasses. Not the grain, though, but sometimes people will graze immature grain crops before the seed is mature. So that's all forage. And then ruminants are those animals that have multi compartmented stomachs, like cows and sheep and goats and deer and bison and buffalo. These are animals that, because of their specialized anatomy and the microorganisms that live within the rumen, which is the first part of that system, they can utilize fiber. So fiber is cellulose primarily. It's glucose units bound together in such a way that we can't break those bonds down. And no vertebrate animal can produce the cellulase needed to break down those bonds. But because of the microorganisms that live within the rumen, Now you have an animal that can utilize this high fiber, low fat, poor protein quality diet and produce from it highest quality food for humans, red meat and full fat dairy. So that's the forage and ruminant animal agriculture. So if you think of beef, you think of sheep production, dairy, those would be under the umbrella of ruminant animal agriculture.
You know, it's interesting as I hear you say that they're able to utilize the fiber in a way that we can't. Uh, Intuitively, that would make me pause and say, well, does that mean that the fiber, if it's not utilized the way they use it, is not going to be as beneficial? Or does it just simply mean that they can do something with the fiber that we can't do? So when you think about that, I know that in my training in nutrition and functional medicine, it is regularly suggested that fiber is necessary to have a healthy gastrointestinal system. But we're also hearing from you that it's not necessarily going to be utilized the way the ruminants use it. So, just a couple of thoughts about that concept.
Well, it's absolutely clear that we're not going to utilize fiber the same way a ruminant can. Any utilization of fiber for a human being is going to come as a result of microbes in the large intestine. And then the question of how much value we get from that, I think there's a fair amount of controversy about. We know that historically there are populations that have eaten diets very low in fiber and been perfectly healthy. We know that there's some evidence when people eliminate fiber and maybe it's certain types of fiber from their diet, longstanding conditions reverse. So it is a controversial subject, and I recognize the boundaries of my knowledge. I don't happen to believe that dietary fiber is essential for human health. And yet, I deal with policy where people define a healthy diet as one which has so much fiber in it. And that's a whole nother
That's right.
conversation. I just don't think the evidence is as clear as many have confidently asserted about it.
Yeah, I agree. And I also believe that it may be because of the, uh, you know, genetic variability. I mean, there's so many different versions of us humans, and maybe some humans have adapted better to uh, either use the fiber or maybe they have a more dependence on it. Who knows? But I
Yeah.
know for me personally, I feel much better when I have less of that in my diet than more of it. So,
Yeah.
you know,
And
just something to think about.
it may be that the people were looking at someone who was on a completely refined, highly processed diet and compared them then to people who were eating a slightly less refined, but still,
That's right.
diet. And so it had some fiber in it. Well, what else were they changing is always the question. And
Yeah. I agree. It's very nuanced, and unfortunately, that's one of the biggest problems with nutritional science is that, to be honest with you, name a diet that's better than this, that highly processed diet. It's probably going to look pretty good. It doesn't suggest, however, that you have to eat that diet that beats that standard American diet, and that doesn't define it as the best diet. There's you have to really compare it in a way that is done more scientifically, where you're really comparing the right thing. So I'm completely agreeing with that. One more part of our little educational session here, and that's the word that I couldn't pronounce very well. Agronomy, if I'm saying that correctly. So you mentioned you had expertise in that. So that's definitely a word that I want my listeners to understand more.
So, agronomy is that agricultural science that's related to food and fiber production. So, it includes other disciplines like soil science, like crop sciences. There are many, many sub disciplines that branch out from there. But basically, agros is like field, and then NOMI science. So field sciences, there's lots and lots of subjects that come under that. But basically, it is an agricultural science at its heart.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember again when we met at Low Carb USA, we had a chance to chat, and I know that part of your foundation is to bridge gaps. Maybe you were doing some gap bridging just by our conversations, as a clinician talking to a guy with your expertise. And but I also know you want to bridge the gaps, between maybe ranchers and the consumers. So it's the clinicians, the consumers, and you seem to be very passionate about this. So talk a little bit about why you think that's important. Uh, and why you think that'll add value, that we have knowledge that maybe is lacking in a clinician, for example, as opposed to a rancher.
Yeah. Well, so I've had clinicians come to me after presentations and thank me because part of my message is what's most important is that people consume enough animal source foods and not worrying about label claims, right? So that and these are people who are serving low socioeconomic populations, so there's a strain to afford, and they appreciated not feeling burdened by telling people they needed to take on more financial burden than was, so there's that side. Um, we've got enough to worry about in life. We don't need to feel guilt over doing something that helps us or recommending something that helps people restore or maintain their metabolic health. Going the other way, imagine dedicating your life to stewarding the resources that you've been given that responsibility for, taking care of animals, producing a healthful and safe product, and yet be told constantly that your product produces heart disease, diabetes, obesity, name the list of chronic diseases that people confidently say are the result of red meat consumption, right? That there's a fair burden there, and part of what I'd
Mm-hmm.
like them to understand is that they're producing the food that we need to attain or maintain our metabolic health and to develop and flourish to whatever genetic capacity that we have. At the same time, I want the clinicians and professionals to understand that when they tell people that there's a dietary approach that can reverse these chronic illnesses, that the reversal of those chronic illnesses has an environmental benefit. That sustainable healthcare has to come from a result of restoring metabolic health, and with that perspective of metabolic health included, and that we can actually build these bridges between producers and consumers, although we're all consumers and we're all producers, but you understand what I mean. That bridging is something that will actually strengthen our communities and improve our overall economy, environment, and social networks.
I like that. And first of all, I just love learning, which is why this podcast is beneficial for me, because I learn as I have these conversations. But I do think that just again, being able to understand, how my food was made, where it came from, all of these little nuances are, it's almost like, as I think about it in this moment, um, the appreciation of what you're eating is so much better when you have more understanding. It's almost like, cooking your own food. You know what you put in. Sometimes, I'm eating some ribs today, and you put these rubs on the rib, right? But you're thinking about the onion and garlic powder and the paprika and the pepper and you know what you put in it, and it's almost like you can taste all of it. But if I had not known what I put in it, right, I don't think it'll be the same experience. And even better, if I had the experience when I made these, my wife actually seasoned these ribs, and while she was seasoning the ribs, I was cutting up the cauliflower so we can make cauliflower mac and cheese. What's cool about that is that we did it together, and
Hmm.
while we were doing that, we were talking about our relationship. So it's like an experience, and if we can connect with people who can talk, talk to me about, it sounds funny, but talk to me about that cow you just killed. It's like I want to, you get to.
Uh,
I mean, it's a whole nother level of understanding, you know, the
yeah.
food.
Why did ribs become so popular in Chicago? Well, because they were a waste product essentially, because the hams and the shoulder were what got, and then
Yeah,
these were these low value, but you had to learn how to cook them right. Okay, there's a
that's right,
tradition that can be handed down. There is history, there is culture. And that's what we
man.
can have with real food, sharing it with our families and telling stories about how grandma did this or those
That's
sorts of
right.
things. You're not going to get that from the highly processed stuff where so I've got three sort of guiding things which I got from someone else, but one is that animal source foods are essential for public health. That's just, and we can talk about which animal source foods and we can talk about how much, but animal source food is essential for public health. Number two is animal agriculture is an essential part of sustainable food systems. There's no either or. You can't separate them. So that's critical. And then that I just talked about that third one, which is animal source foods are an essential part of food culture and tradition.
Mm, okay.
And it's going to look different depending on what your background is, where you come from, all of that. But this, sharing of meals, as you just said, the
Mhm,
sharing of preparation of meals, and you
mhm.
think
That's
about
right.
all of that and the opportunities to teach and pass on, as well as,
Mhm.
we don't only eat protein. When, we don't just eat for nourishment of the nutrients, we nourish our souls and our relationships through the food that we eat. And that's not going to come from Doritos. I
This
just,
is not.
it's um, so those are things that kind of guide me as well, that we really must reestablish this real food culture and all that goes with that.
Yeah, thank you for saying all of that. I do remember when I learned a little bit about the history of why African Americans eat what African Americans eat. And a lot of it went back to what you said, which is this is what people didn't value. So they gave you those things. And then you had to figure out how do I make these things taste really good? And they did a good job figuring that out. So, and that's, I do love ribs. Let's be clear about that. So I appreciate that, and I really think that's really a interesting perspective. It's just again getting to know your food a little bit better. One of the things that's interesting, I actually we do couch conversations with the doctor on Facebook with Congressman Daddy Davis of Illinois, and one of our co-hosts is Dr. Terry Mason. He's a vegan. He's been on, you know, uh, Forks Over Knives, things like that. He invited a guest, Dr. Ken Williams, who was the previous president of, I think, the American College of Cardiology, and they're both vegan, and it's really interesting platform where you have kind of a low carb guy like myself, and you have a low fat doc and his guest, and I bring it up to say that there's this perception that that if you eat low carb, keto, or carnivore, you don't really care about the environment, right? That's the messaging. And if you care about the environment, you eat more plants. You don't eat animals. So I think that that perception is one of the many reasons why people sometimes push back when we talk about eating animal-based diets. But I'm not sure that's the right perception. So maybe from your perspective, you can share how you see that issue and whether or not we need to rethink how we perceive, who's really okay with the environment or not.
Yeah, I agree completely that that message is out there. I think that that message is unfounded, of a plant only diet being better for the environment than an omnivorous diet or even one that is exclusively animal source food. Um, there's a couple things. One, everything we do in this life influences, affects the environment in which we're doing it. And so someone in the conversation is deciding which bits we'll pay attention to and which bits we won't, and how we'll only look at the negative of some and not look at the negative of others. So we need to be careful with the conversation overall. That the vast majority of what happens frequently is people confuse agricultural land with what we technically call arable land, but you could think of that as the land that you can till, that you can plow and disc and produce
Mhm.
annual crops on. And the arable land is a very small portion of the overall farmland, a total agricultural land. And so people will look at the figures for how much land is used to graze beef cattle, for example, and they'll think, well, we could just convert that to growing soybeans and look at how many more
Mhm.
people we could feed. Well, the reality is you can't grow soybeans there. And you shouldn't try, because if you were to do that, you would cause enormous ecological damage. Um, People may be familiar with Dust Bowl, and that was the result of plowing land that should have remained in prairie, but it was converted to trying to grow wheat, because at that time we wanted the United States to become a bigger wheat producer than Russia, because in World War I we had lost access to Russian wheat. Sound familiar? Um,
Hmm.
so, there were these programs to promote wheat production out in the southern plains. Well, that came at an enormous cost, and hopefully we've learned a little something since then. Um, so, we need to also acknowledge that plant source foods are not as nutritionally valuable as animal source foods. And so, if you're going to replace nutrients from animal source foods with plant source foods, it's going to take a heck of a lot more plant source foods to replace a given amount of animal source food in the diet. And then there's other complications, like, does the quality of the diet influence our ingestive behavior? So if I'm trying to meet my essential amino acid requirement from cereals and they're deficient, I'm going to have to eat a lot more of those to get the essential amino acids we need, but I'm also going to get a lot more starch.
Right.
Okay. And so it's a very, but at the same time we've had people talking about protein yield from plants and animals and comparing it on a gross yield basis, not
Mhm.
a quality basis. Same thing
Mhm.
with calories. And so those are not appropriately sophisticated conversations, and yet it's what people resort to. Um, there actually have been studies, model exercises to try to say, well, what would be the result if we eliminated animal agriculture from North America? And we would make a very small impact based on greenhouse gas emissions, but it would come at the cost of increased nutrient deficiencies and imbalancing the food system. Like I said, we
Mhm.
can't have a sustainable food system without animal agriculture. And ruminant animals in particular have an advantage in that the vast majority of what they eat we can't utilize. So they're not competitive to humans. They absolutely increase the quantity of food and its quality for human utilization. And so globally, I'm actually advocating for what I call the ruminant revolution, which is we need to increase the productivity and efficiency of ruminant animal agriculture globally, which by doing that will actually reduce its impact. So, rough sorts of things. If you compare beef production in the United States to beef production in Zimbabwe, beef production in Zimbabwe has 5 times the emissions intensity of beef production in the United States. If you look at beef production in the United States versus beef production in Brazil, Brazil has like 3 times the number of cattle that we do, but they produce less beef. So as we have improved the productivity in North America, we've actually decreased the emissions. We've decreased the amount of water. We've decreased the feed required. We've decreased the land required to produce the same amount of beef compared to what it required in 1970s. So all of these things point to, the necessity of having these systems as part of the environment. And then I can talk to people who are involved in what we call the cow-calf sector of the beef production system. And they will say that this cow-calf system, and you could run stockers as well, and you might be able to finish depending on a number of things. But certainly the cow-calf is the only food producing system, not considering other ruminant systems like lamb or goat, that shares the environment. If I'm going to plant soybeans or corn or wheat, I must go in and eliminate the existing vegetation to plant my
Mm.
crop.
Hmm.
So
That's
any
true.
wildlife that was part of that, out you go. So there's this very different reality in terms of what it requires to produce these foods of either animal or plant origin. And frequently they're not considered. Um, the last figures for greenhouse gas emission budget from EPA put all of agriculture at somewhere around 9% of man-produced greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. That was agriculture, 9, but plant agriculture is 5. So more than
Mm.
half of that. Animal agriculture is 4, and beef production is
Hmm.
2. And
That's
and
that's
the
not
emit
consistent.
no,
Well, what
no.
I'm saying is it's not consistent. When you watch the documentaries, I mentioned my colleagues who were in vegan documentaries, you hear numbers that are completely different than what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. So, are we using the wrong resources? I mean, what's going on with how are they giving? And I guess you kind of explained some of it when you first started the conversation. Is how what they're measuring, but why are these numbers all over the place? Or, shouldn't they be fairly consistent, or the sources of these numbers?
You would hope, and this is part of the
Right.
world that I get to live in. Um, it's it, there are some points in time where, for example, a study gets released where they make some estimate of all of the emissions from beef production and they compare it only to the tailpipe emissions from transportation, right? So they compare everything it takes to produce beef, and then all they look at over here is what it is burnt from fossil fuels. And
Hmm.
then they come up with something like, beef production, beef animals produce more greenhouse gases than all transportation, right? And it was not an apples to apples comparison. That study, some people pushed back against the authors and they had a conversation, scientific debate. Authors admitted that in fact is what they had done. It was not an appropriate analysis. And so they then retracted and released new figures. Doesn't matter. Once that's out in the public, then that's what people, cite, because that's what they want it to
Mm-hmm.
be at some point.
Mm-hmm.
The total greenhouse gas emissions from all of agriculture, animal agriculture, is somewhere in the 14% of total global, which again points to we should not compare global figures to US figures. We shouldn't compare different countries because there are vast differences in terms of what the economies are between different countries. So that's part of it. Um, the, there are people who make a great deal of money by getting people upset and scared, and so that's their business. I sometimes refer to it as the outrage industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, I just think people need to hear some other information, and meanwhile recognize that the same people who are misquoting over on one are also telling us that we should be eating a diet which, from our personal experience, we know to not be one that we stay healthy on. So just okay, don't need to listen there, need to focus on what it takes for me to be healthy, for others to be healthy, and then move forward on that. And again, different study, again, not an apples to apples comparison, but one estimate of the greenhouse gas emissions from all of US healthcare pegged that at 10%. Now, again, it's not apples to apples. So rather than do an absolute comparison, let's just accept that healthcare has an environmental impact. It also has an
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
economic impact. It also has a societal impact. And
That's right.
anytime we look at sustainability, we must look at those three pillars, or we're not having a conversation about sustainability, because there's always trade offs. Like I said,
Mm-hmm.
everything we
That's
do to
right.
produce food is going to have an impact. So, how do we evaluate those? How do we balance the cost and the benefit? And we have not yet, my experience with conversations about sustainable healthcare always brings in the assumption of what's a healthy diet, right? So that's going to include fiber. It's going to mostly plants, whatever,
Right.
whatever.
Plants,
And
fruit,
my
vegetables,
pushback
etc.
is, how do we know that? Why are we accepting that into the conversation? Or at best, let's pursue two possible definitions. Um, so if in fact people have done studies looking at beef production where they talk about um, um, ecosystem services, and so these are benefits to society that aren't compensated to the producer. Things like wildlife, water quality, fire mitigation, those sorts of things. And at the end of those calculations, they're already saying that there's a net positive for society from beef production, right? Not counting the product. And that's factoring in some cost of carbon in the emissions. And we don't yet fully understand the carbon cycle. So there's a lot of questions to be answered there. But one, it's a cycle. We need to accept that. And that's before we ever bring in any conversation that would say, well, if eating more beef and less processed whatever leads to some reduction in diabetes, how do we accredit that to on the positive side against any negative? So a lot of these conversations have been evolving over years. Unfortunately, the sound bites come out from
Mm-hmm.
some point in time, and then they just ricochet around on social media, the web, whatever. And it by the time the science comes out to say, no, this is in fact what's happening, the other thing has already implanted itself into the consciousness. And so part of this is, just trying to get people to recognize that there's other information out there that they can, maybe learn more about.
It's this need to be open to challenging your belief systems. I had to complete an assignment last night where we read an article, and the article was really more focused on motivational interviewing. But I did notice as I read the article that the article was, can a dietitian who uses motivational interviewing influence the uh, consumption of saturated fat of their patients? Now, of course, it was implied the goal is to reduce saturated fat, and I thought that was interesting. So, but this is what was interesting about the article when they looked at the conclusions. The They were able to influence and reduce the consumption of saturated fat as a dietitian using motivational interviewing. However, it had no impact by doing that on their hemoglobin A1C, their BMI, and some other metric that should matter. So to me, it would. So even though the article was not focused on that, I noticed one or two things. One is that they preferred an article that message that low fat or reducing saturated fat is a good thing. And then second, but it just made me pause and say, I wonder if they noticed that it didn't benefit
Yeah,
any of the
yeah.
things that matter. And I don't know if they did, but to me, it should make them pause and say, huh. So I just think there's a lot of moments like that when people should question their thought processes and they just don't. So I just want to live in a world where we do that on a regular basis.
Mm.
And I had been a vegetarian for 8 years, and I've been doing low carb, probably close to 10 years now. And I just made assumptions about the ability as a educated person to figure out how to, as you suggested earlier, how do we replace the protein that comes from animal with some type of plant-based variety? And I learned, and I've reviewed in school that, beans, lentils, chickpeas, things like that have essential amino acids that maybe brown rice doesn't have. So you have to put these things together. So, but the question is, when you do that, and let's just say you're sophisticated enough to do that, and I don't know if all my patients will be, right? So even if you do it perfectly well, the chances that that'll then have the quality of protein that an animal product would have is questionable. So what's your thoughts on, even if you do it the right way and you do it perfectly, what's the chances that you'll be able to achieve that goal of, getting close to that quality?
Yeah, great question. I I'll first point out that for a boy of age 8, physical limitation in gut size, that I have been told by authorities that a boy of age 8 physically cannot eat enough rice and lentils to meet his lysine requirement if he had
Mm.
unlimited access. So there's at least an age related complication in here. Number two would be this combining needs to happen at every meal. Like you can't, have some at
Right.
one time and then a couple hours later, so it's just easier. It's more straightforward to include some animal source food with your meal. And whether
Mhm.
that's, you know, lunch meat in your sandwich or eggs scrambled up in your rice or whatever that is, this idea that you can, manage the limitations of a plant only diet, I think is something that only people in high income countries and in the high income portions of those countries can manage. And frankly, I'm a little suspicious of anything that requires me to do a lot of supplementation. I'm not against supplements, but if that's, there's a whole lot of problems with the supplement industry. So those are things, I liked, maybe I'm guilty of oversimplifying. It seems to me like we've got vegans, plant only, we've got omnivorous, and then we've got carnivore, animal only.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the
Mm-hmm.
three choices. And I have no problem thinking that somebody can form, obviously, an omnivorous diet. And I've seen enough people be healthy for long enough on an only animal source diet that I feel comfortable with that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I just recognize that there's lots and lots of evidence of human beings being harmed because they don't have enough animal source food in their diet. Now, granted, these are coming from low and middle income countries where there's but I think that if we have a more sophisticated way to look at it, we might start seeing that in high income countries as well. Again, we've got income distribution disparities, right? So that's an issue. I remember after, I think it was when we first met, physician from St. Louis came up to me after my presentation and suggested that what he had seen in my presentation is what he's seeing in some of his patients. And what I had
Mm-hmm.
presented was evidence about what happens when you feed pigs on a lysine deficient diet. You see more subcutaneous fat, you see more intramuscular fat, and you see smaller back muscle, loin eye areas, loin muscle, right? And he was then telling me that there's apparently a relationship between intramuscular fat in the back muscle and chronic back pain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, if we're, first of all, cereals are a poor source of lysine. And then when we process them to make them brown and crispy, we make that lysine almost completely unavailable. And so now let's think about somebody who's eating a diet that's heavily based on these processed cereal products. It's not hard to imagine that they're not getting enough lysine.
Hmm.
So
Wow, that's
so we
interesting.
may be seeing he from the meat scientist that I got that data from. He used a phrase of subclinical kwashiorkor,
Mm.
and kwashiorkor, as I understand it, is like a West African word that basically means the sickness the baby gets when the next baby arrives. And so
Yeah.
you've got a child that's weaned onto the cereal, whatever mush, when it gets weaned to support, okay. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but subclinical. So we may be seeing a lot of essential amino acid deficiencies that are being
Mm.
perceived as some other condition. And the sadness is this is in the United States. Now, what evidence? Well, evidence, no, but in the 2015 dietary guidelines, first of all, it was only in 2010 that they started looking at protein specifically in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. And then in 2015, they produced some data from NHANES, and there's
Mm-hmm.
issues with this, but it's what we've got. And they showed that 40% of Americans don't get enough protein, and most females over 8 aren't getting enough protein. And there are two problems with that beyond the data. Number one is that's against a low target, RDA,
Right.
which
Yes.
isn't a target, it's a minimum,
A
right?
minimum. That's right.
Okay. And then number two is they're treating all protein, because that's crude protein. That's not actual protein. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're treating a pound or whatever, some unit of crude protein from plants as if it's equivalent to a, same amount of protein from animals. And it's not. We know that. That's not controversial. And so there's some evidence that and yet they're able to look at that data and say, well, protein isn't a nutrient of concern. And there's other evidence that I've been speaking to in other presentations. This is a global issue. And the current situation is not going to make this better with record prices for inputs, fertilizer, fuel, disruptions in food chains. It's
Yeah,
we're heading into some kind of scary times. And so that gets us back to we absolutely must buy what's available, affordable, and appropriate. And, if that's hot dogs, it's hot dogs. If it's the lost leader eggs, it's eggs. If it's the store
that's
brand
right.
ground beef, it's the store brand ground beef. But we must, canned tuna, canned meats.
That's
These
right.
things are available to us, and push come to shove, that's what we need to be eating. And part of my messaging is we need to rethink a lot of the quality claims that people have been making.
Yeah, they are. That's actually one of the things I want to speak to in a minute about quality. But I will say this: when I think about when you started talking about um, this idea that some of my back pain can be related to, having too much, fat being deposited in that part of my body. I think about, uh, one of my previous guests was Dr. Gurpreet Pata, and he's in the St. Louis area. So I'm not sure that was the doctor you're talking to, but he's awesome. And for anybody that hasn't heard that episode, yes, your pain won't go away if you don't achieve metabolic health, is the message he was saying. You have to be metabolically healthy if you're not going to be in pain. So it was but he talks a lot about, he thinks about disparities because he's in a community that's struggling. And so he's always trying to put those two things together. And it really made me also think about your, this thought about, does it have to be grass fed? Does it have to be pasture raised? And, when I started my journey and we started doing healthy living events with Advocate Rural Healthcare, I was, part of the team that put the slides together. And one of the slides we would always share was comparing some beef that was, grass fed, no antibiotics and things of that nature, no hormones, versus ones that did have those things. But I know it's very nuanced, and I knew that the population I was serving, that shouldn't really just focus on that, but it was more of a kind, maybe when you get to an ideal state is what I was thinking at the time. Now, since then, I've been less concerned about that, but I do think it's important that I hear from your perspective, should people be concerned about the quality of the beef, rather it's avoiding ones that are treated with antibiotics and hormones, or just simply rather it was grass-fed, pasture-raised? Is there a value proposition? Is there a return on investment that would justify the prices and things of that nature, particularly for people who have concerns about costs?
Mm-hmm. Well, personally, when I got started in all this metabolic health space, I named my effort grass-based health. I'm trained in grazing systems, all of that. So it tripped all of my confirmation biases when I started coming into this space. And then I started reviewing the literature, and I got less and less convinced. So, indeed, it's nuanced. We need to take a look at each one of those, but we could also take a look at, did Dr. Atkins insist on grass fed organic meat for his patients? No, it wasn't available. How about, Pennington? How about Eads? These people that came before us, no, that wasn't a requirement. Okay, so it's not a requirement. Um, people talk about without hormones. Well, what they mean is without exogenous hormones. The animal produces hormones, and the difference in hormone level between the two isn't that great. And plant source foods have compounds that are hormonal in their activity, and if high enough, can produce an effect in mammals. Okay, so and oh, by the way, eggs are going to have far more, than beef is going to have. It's an
Mm-hmm.
egg. There's going to be some
Right.
hormones in there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, in terms of hormone use, there are thresholds that are set. There are monitoring programs. There's protocols in effect to monitor for residue levels to ensure that they don't exceed those conservative levels. Same thing with pesticide residues. Okay, so all of those lead me to say what we can buy in the supermarket is healthful. It's under a supervision program, so I'm not worried about that. I'm not saying to worry about it if you don't buy it from something that goes through the inspection process, but I am going to say that much of that isn't under the same monitoring program. So you really
Mm-hmm.
need to know where it's coming from. Um, and if people like grass-fed beef, then and they can afford it, doesn't cause them additional stress, then that's what they should
Mm-hmm.
eat and enjoy. It's a lot of people. How did somebody put it to me? In the restaurant trade, everybody wants grass-fed until it's a steak on their plate. And then they realize it's not the same thing as the ribeye that they're
Mm-hmm.
used to. And there's
Mm-hmm.
reasons for why we do what we do in the existing systems, and they should always be reevaluated and open. But one of the things, it's easier, it's you can more consistently produce that acceptable product. Tenderness, flavor, right, color, those sorts of things are more easily achieved under the commercial systems than with
Mm-hmm.
the grass only system. In many parts of the country, you don't have grass 365 days of the year. You may have noticed this in
Right.
Chicago. There's something
That's
called
right.
winter. And so we have systems that sort of have to take into account um, seasonal differences. Um, so all of that says to me that, oh, one more thing. The whole question about omega content, um, you can easily overcome whatever benefit you think you're getting by buying grass fed, by eating walnuts, for example. And just and I'm not convinced that we're accurately accounting for animal source omega 3s versus plant source omega 3s, same with omega 6s, and accounting for those differences. I'm also suspicious that all of that came out of the narrative that eating, animal fat was the driver of heart disease. And so if you go back and read some of the first articles about omega, fish oil and omega 6 and omega 3, there's a line in one of them that goes something close to, the Greenland Eskimos have a low incidence of heart disease despite eating a diet high in fat. And there you are. Was it the fat in the diet that was the heart? Was that right? Oh, no, 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 no. It must be the fish oil. Well, now we've got a multi-billion-dollar fish oil industry,
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm.
like, we have an olive oil industry, just like, so we keep having these paradoxes in our theories about health and a product that fits rather
That's
than
right. That's
saying
right.
maybe it's not the fat.
Right. 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 That's funny. And but I don't know that they're pausing to ask that question. And we should encourage people to do that, because if we don't pause and ask that question, we will continue going down this rabbit hole that we shouldn't be going down. And And I wonder, as I think about the animals that we're talking about, another kind of thought is, we kind of spoke about this earlier, in terms of the environment, but people who eat low carb, keto, carnivore may be perceived as not really being that concerned about the welfare of the animal. Now, I watch the Animal Channel a lot, so I don't know. I think the wild is not very friendly to any creature that lives out there.
Right.
It's pretty amazing, and I'm sure there's neighborhoods that can be perceived the same way. But so I just want to talk briefly about the welfare of the animal. We talked a little bit about how if we get to know our ranchers, and the ranchers really are intimately connected to these animals, so they may have some a kind of a relationship with them, just like you have pets, right? So what's your thoughts on this perception that people who eat animals don't care about their welfare? Is that really a reasonable statement, or how would you clean that statement up so that people can have a different perspective about it?
So I think it's important for people to recognize that the difference between animal rights and animal welfare. Animal welfare is the responsibility and interest of everyone within animal agriculture and any pet owner for that matter.
Hmm. Hmm.
Any responsible human being who's dealing with animals. Animal rights is this proposition that animals and humans are equal. And sorry, that's not a starter for me. In fact, I've heard one person say you can't be for human rights if you're for animal rights. So we could just let that float off onto the side. Don't need to pursue much, but there is a difference, and the animal rights agenda tends to be more radical. Tends to be where we get the false videos that get released to make people scared about how animals are being treated, et cetera, et cetera. There are
Hmm.
those occasions of mistreatment. Those are typically involving some kind of tragedy within the humans that are owning that operation. I mean, and the industry is very interested in getting that taken care of. Health of some kind, mental or physical, fiscal. Um, if you're there's not big margins here in the animal ag businesses at the producer level, right? So anything that you do, you are trying to make sure, frankly, that you're profitable. And if you're doing things that raise stress on an animal, I've heard that stress is not good for a human being. Do you agree with that?
No,
Same.
that it's not necessary.
It's not necessary. Yeah, okay. Too
Yeah,
much chronic stress. It's not good for
right.
human
Chronic
health.
stress is
It's
That's
not
right.
good for animals.
It's
It
never good. It's
and so
micro trauma.
yeah, lots of things are done to improve the comfort and again nutrition and overall health of animals. To again, it's a business, which differentiates it from a pet relationship, right? Working dogs versus house dogs, right? Very different. Um, Not the least of which is what the working dog might have rolled in, and you'd rather not have on your couch. Um, Still, so there are wonderful stories. If you're taking care of livestock in an outdoor setting in the northern tier of states during certain months, you're putting your life at risk. And this idea of animals come first, right? The cows come first. You take care of them, that's your responsibility. And
Mm,
some of these are multi-generation operations, and the herds are multi-generation herds. Sometimes they're still influenced by the decisions grandpa or dad made when he bought a different breed bull. to change the genetics in that herd because he had a vision of which way it should go. So these things are a reality to people who are living that kind of life that I think a lot of people who haven't been exposed to that, they don't quite have. I mean, when I talk to somebody who's third generation or fourth generation on a piece of property, and I wonder what it's like, to walk every day around property that your grandfather walked across. It's like, what's that
Mm-hmm.
like?
Right.
And so,
Right.
are we going to believe that these people are doing things intentionally to degrade that resource or to abuse? And no, I
Mm-mm.
not my experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And when I did insurance physicals several years ago, I met a lot of farmers. I would actually go and do an insurance physical for a farmer, and just wonderful, hardworking people. I would have to meet them super early because they had a super busy schedule.
Yeah.
I was like, is there anybody on the planet that works as hard as these farmers? And they definitely seem to care about their farm, the land, and the animals that they raised on them. So I could see how that makes a lot of sense. And again, the whole purpose is to see the world through that rancher's lens. So as we kind of are getting to wrapping up, I do want to ask the big question, which is it possible? And I kind of asked this question for Diana Rogers of the Sacred Cow, right? So, is it possible that we can have a more sustainable way to raise animals? It's definitely a good idea. It makes sense. I think we can even get those on the other side of the aisle to agree that if we're going to have some type of agreeable approach that includes animals, this would be the way. So, but we have big corporations controlling the narrative, and do you think we have the potential to transition from our current state to one? Just like in health, I want to transition us from disease management to maybe lifestyle management or healing and reversal of disease. And I think that that's a more sustainable model. I think it's a better model, and I think we'll save a ton of money and save a lot of people. But do we have the capacity to make sustainable farming, regenerative farming, the future of how we grow and raise animals?
Yeah. A thought occurs to me. I think I heard Dr. Unwin say this. Your choice is between lifestyle, intervention, a lifestyle change, or lifetime medication. Which would you like?
Right,
Offer
right.
that to the patient. Okay. Um, I, I, I think that the answer is yes. And I'm firmly convinced of it. And part of that is until people catch the vision,
Mm-hmm,
then that's what we have to get people to see, because once you know what
mm-hmm,
the goal is, then you find a way to achieve it. Humanity has done that through millennia. And conversely, if there's one universally true statement, right? It won't work here. Well,
mm.
right. If you have anything to say about it, you're right. It won't work where you have any role in this, but
Mhm,
let's go
mhm,
find somebody that's already doing it. And, you know, part of it is I'm saying we have to. This isn't an
mhm,
optional thing. Today
mhm,
in the world, we have somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of children under 5 years old stunted because they're not getting the essential nutrition that's best provided by animal source foods. A third of women
mhm,
globally of childbearing age are anemic, same reason. Okay,
mm,
we have a global epidemic of metabolic illness. And,
mhm.
and that
Yeah.
is not the result of overeating animal source food, just the contrary. We have projections that within 28 years, we're going to have doubled food production, uh, increased demand of 2/3 for animal source protein. And yet that's too low. I could argue we're seeing globally a movement that by 2050, something like 70% of humanity will live in urban areas. that all of these, that the average age of human beings is increasing, right? So this increase in 2 billion human beings by whatever time frame you want to look at is not going to come from more children 15 and under. It's going to come from more seniors. Okay,
That's right.
all of that is part of what we're facing, and we must find a way to meet those needs, because if we don't, then bad things happen. War, famine, pestilence, right? Those all sort of go together. And this
Hmm.
is not, and I mentioned briefly before, this current situation that we're seeing, that's going to create some issues. But
That's right.
we already have the animals in agriculture globally. If we could increase their productivity, we would lower their environmental impact, and we provide more animal source food that humanity requires. They estimate that degree of stunting in sub-Saharan Africa represents an 11% of GDP drag on development,
Mm,
because these human
mm,
beings, our brothers and sisters, cannot develop to their full potential because they didn't develop fully the mind that they need to operate in society. And so those are things that I just take as a requirement. It's not a question of can we, it's we must.
hmm.
And let's find a way to do that. Let's find the resources, let's train the people, let's deploy what we need to in order to see that happen. But again, this means that we have to just frankly confront some of the narratives. And that's the way that I would begin to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think having these conversations is doing exactly that, spreading the word, exposing people who had not heard these messages to this message. I think all of those things will help us to achieve the goal of hopefully, uh, you know, having everybody fully aware of what the goal could be. And then we come to a goal that we all agree on and we start making progress. We know that our current state may not be the best state. So I think continuously improving and hearing from experts who have spent, essentially a lifetime learning these things and sharing it. And then we incorporate what we know and we hear other people and we go from there. So that's awesome. And that's also why I want to make sure you're protecting your nest. So let's pause and think about what you're going to do over the next 12 months to protect your nest. Where do you plan to give some additional attention?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've given it some thought. Um, well, for me, it begins with sobriety. That's a non-negotiable for me.
That's
Um,
right.
and then, that has a spiritual component to it for me,
Hmm.
but it
Hmm.
also it points to the relationships that are in my life that are more important than whatever I might do in a advocacy role. um,
Hmm.
Sleep is something that I could probably get a little better at. um, I'm pretty happy with where the nutrition is. um,
Yeah.
Exercise, I've never been a gym rat. That isn't it, but I can go walking around my place. My
Hmm.
wife got me a 5 pound chunk of rock. It's a nice round ball, and I can just kind of throw that around when I'm standing at my desk like this. Um, I think that emotionally for me, yeah, emotional sobriety is part of it as well. And learning that um, I really I can get overwrought about what I think other people think of me. And
Hmm.
at the end of the
Mm,
day, there's only a few people whose opinion I really care about.
mm. I love
And
that.
I mean, I'm
That's
I'm not,
huge.
yeah, not going to be nasty. That's not my nature. But yeah, if somebody is going to start reacting badly to what I relate, and my mentors and my colleagues are saying, what you're saying is true, right? Objectively
Hmm.
true. Well, then, I'm not going to be able to, you can make yourself very sick trying to make everybody happy.
Oh man, that's an understatement. And
Mm.
be careful on Twitter, man, because that's a
Yeah,
man, that's a scary place. And I definitely all of that resonates with me. I definitely feel like sleep is critical, and I know that sobriety is important because I've seen a lot of that, not just in my patients, but even in my family. It's just one of those things that we have to wrestle with. So I'm really happy that that's a focus. And again, I've mentioned before on this podcast, I kind of use Dr. Ben Bokikio's 15 minutes twice a week. So if you had not looked into his approach, I know he was actually at Low Carb USA when we spoke. It's 15 minutes twice a week. So that's
mm,
an easy way to do the muscle part. And that's the only doctor's advice I'll give today, that if you're looking for something that's easy, which is what I was looking for, shout out to Dr. Ben Bokikio. Um, so I guess letting people know how to find you, your hashtag on Twitter, and let's get that out to folks, and any other resources you want to share before we wrap up.
sure. Once again, thanks again for the opportunity. You can find me all over social media. If you find another Ballerstedt out there and it's not me, it's probably kin. I'd like to know about him. So, grass based on Twitter and Instagram, grass based health on Facebook. You can email me at peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com. I have a channel on YouTube with a lot of my talks. Just look for Peter Ballerstedt.
Awesome. I appreciate you. I think we had a nice connection when we first met. I look forward to continuing that. I know some of our colleagues that we're recording this. I think we have the metabolic health conference that's going on right now. Had not gone to that conference yet. Hopefully, we'll look into it next year. I will be going to KetoCon, and I'll be going to Low Carb USA again this year. So looking forward to that in July and August. But I really appreciate you. Appreciate this conversation. I hope it did provide some insights for those who are listening, and I just hope we can continue to merge the clinicians, the consumers, and the ranchers, so that we can all grow together. And we all have different insights, and we want to put those all together at the table, and then figure out what's the best path to move forward. So thank you again for spending some time with me and those who are watching this episode. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in San Diego.
Well, we'll be there. That's right. I can't wait. They have some great food. So if anybody doesn't believe low carb tastes good, they should go to Low Carb USA and taste the wonderful food. So thank you so much. And as we conclude today's episode, I want each and every one of you to be comfortable with the evolution you are experiencing as you learn new ways of seeing the world we live in. And like the food we consume, which nourishes our body, the consumption of knowledge will continue to nourish our brain, so that we can use that knowledge to help shape us into a better version of ourselves each and every day. So as you evolve, embrace it. Is exactly what you will need to heal or maintain your physical, mental, or spiritual health. Yes, it's the perspective of others, like today's guest, that will help us along our way, so that at the end, we won't have many regrets, but instead we'll know that we've done all we can to achieve our health related goals. So I thank you for spending time with me today. And until we have our next episode, be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest.